But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Shane Burley and Ben Lorber, who are the authors of the new book out this week, Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Antisemitism. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us on.
Hey, thanks for having us.
I guess just to begin with, anti-Semitism is on the rise. We've just seen in Australia in the last week or so, conservative media have put out a new documentary, Never Again, looking at anti-Semitism mainly on campuses. Is that where you see the main threat of anti-Semitism is coming from?
I can kick us off. No, that is not where I see the main threat of anti-Semitism coming from. This ends up at a time when Israel is basically persecuting a genocide in Gaza, that in defense of the war effort, people use accusations of anti-Semitism leveled primarily against Palestine solidarity protesters, versus where we can look empirically where the rise of anti-Semitism is actually happening, which is on the far right, both in the kind of more mainstream political sphere, but also in the growth of white nationalism.
Thanks, Shane. And that's not to say that there isn't anti-Semitism right now that's happening, that's connected in some way, to what's going on in Palestine. There have been several studies that tend to show that during upticks in Israeli attacks on Palestinians, there are upticks of anti-Semitism that happen against Jews in the diaspora. Like, we've seen this through the last three of Israel's wars on Gaza. And so it's not surprising that when a state claims to speak in the name of world Jewry while it's committing a horrific genocide, that there can be a spike. Now that doesn't excuse the inexcusable targeting of Jews as Jews that happens around the world, but it just is to acknowledge. And of course, we're seeing things like graffiti on synagogues that might say "Free Palestine," or random Jews being harassed on the street by people who claim that they're doing so to express anger at what Israel's doing, and that stuff is horrific. It's also important to name that that we don't know exactly where the political allegiances of people who do that kind of stuff. They could be radical rightists. They could be people who claim to have some kind of left affinity. They could be random people. But yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism is on the rise right now. But as Shane said, the far right is the main source. Here in the U.S., we're seeing right-wing media leaders like Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens, who are straight up blasting out anti-Semitic conspiracy theories with like a bluntness that they never have before. So it's real.
Yeah, I think just to pick up too on what Ben said, if you look at a lot of the data from the last year, a lot of the sort of anti-Semitic incidents, if it's attacks, if it's rhetoric, that even do cite Israel-Palestine are outside of the organized Palestine solidarity movement. They might be coming from random individuals who maybe take on an anti-Semitic act or engage in violence and then use some kind of Palestine rhetoric as a justification. The same thing happens in the far right, where pretty open anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are then repurposed by using the term Zionist or using that as a code word. And so I think it's important to kind of step back and say, like, when we're talking about this, and when large institutions like in the United States, the Anti-Defamation League, talk about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, if you actually look at a lot of where the actual verifiable anti-Semitism is coming from, even when it's using that rhetoric of anti-Zionism, it's not coming necessarily from within an organized movement that cares about Palestinian liberation.
In the book, the history of anti-Semitism is obviously examined quite closely. I guess in relation to anti-Semitic incidents in the US, one of the principal bodies that have monitored it for some time is the ADL. Ben and Shane, could you speak to, I guess, understanding anti-Semitism, what it is, and what role the ADL has played in monitoring and responding to it, and what you find problematic about its approach?
Sure. I mean, if you want us to talk about how to understand anti-Semitism, I mean, you could write a book on that. Just kidding. But so giving like a 30-second summary, anti-Semitism really evolved out of a European Christianity as the new religion of proto-Christianity kind of emerged out of Judaism 2,000 years ago, and especially as the Roman Empire became Christian in the 4th century. Jews became like the easy to define kind of other to Christian believers. And over the centuries, Jews were demonized as the enemies of Christ, as the killers of Jesus, as the embodiments of evil. All kinds of myths evolved, right? Jews persecuting Christians. So they claimed Jews drinking baby blood. Jews had horns. Jews were literally the devil. All this stuff. And so as the centuries progressed in the modern era, to skip over in many years, right, those myths kind of evolved into new tropes of Jews controlling the world, right? And in particular, Jews controlling capitalism, Jews controlling communism, Jews controlling the government, the media, the economy, right? Basically, as the modern world evolved, this myth of the demonic Jew at the root of everything that was confusing or alienating or exploitative about the world really has been used by nationalist leaders to mobilize millions, whether that was early 20th century European nationalist movements or fascist movements, or today movements like the MAGA movement. And so that's anti-Semitism in a nutshell. It's a right-wing reactionary ideology that claims to provide like a meta explanation for why the world is so wrong and who's to blame and what to do about it. And that's why it's so dangerous. It can be a really effective mobilizing tool used by fascists and authoritarians. So that's anti-Semitism. I'll let Shane, you want to add to that? Also talk about the EDL?
Sure, sure. And I think this is actually where, if we're talking about sometimes anti-Semitism creeping into areas of the left, it has been in areas where there's weaker sort of analysis on how capital, empire, and systems of power work, and where conspiracy theories and populism that's sort of undefined take the place of, for example, class consciousness and things that motivate liberatory movements. And so that's in a lot of ways how anti-Semitism works. It picks up on class rage and the rage of real discontent. And usually like the kind of fuel that goes to that fire is legitimate oftentimes, as we saw in things like the farm crisis in the US or Great Depression leading into the 30s and 40s. But what ends up happening is that this false answer is able to direct the anger away from those who are actually in power and onto the specter of the Jew. I think one thing that's important, and this gets to the question of the ADL and a question of things like weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations, but also just kind of like a misunderstanding in general, is that we believe, and we talk about this in the book, is that anti-Semitism actually is a relatively coherent ideology that has transferred over time and has contours to it, meaning that it actually works a particular way and it has some particular familiarity through different generations. Obviously, it started as a specifically Christian construct that then was secularized as we moved into the modern period. And people are looking for different answers for how to explain the alienations they felt in modern culture, urbanity, technology, things like that. But what a lot of times what the ADL does and other organizations is instead look at what they think attacks on Jewish safety are and then work backwards from that to define them as anti-Semitism. So, for example, if Israel is obviously the most important thing for Jewish safety, then anti-Zionism is a de facto attack on Jewish safety and Jewish identity, and therefore must be understood in the larger context of anti-Semitism. And the problem ends up being that robs people. Well, there's a couple problems. One is that's used as an opportunistic attack on liberation movements, but it also ends up kind of robbing people of the useful analysis of anti-Semitism. You are not able to actually do anything about that. You're not able to build a movement to confront it. You're not able to build alliances to stop it if you don't actually understand how it works.
And I want to back up a bit and just say that really what happened was right after the 6-Day War, when Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and other areas really came into being, the global left really started to develop a politics of Palestine solidarity. And what happened was Israel's defenders got scared. Israel's defenders thought, how can we deflect the conversation, right? Because on the face of it, Israel's occupation, Israel's apartheid, the Nakba going back to 1948, the ongoing Nakba, the whole legacy of settler colonization in Palestine is transparently unjust. So how do we distract from that? How do we counter these arguments? And pretty soon in the 70s, they came up with the idea of calling it anti-Semitic, right? The thesis that they developed, they called the new anti-Semitism. Basically, like Shane was saying, that any attack on Israel or its policies, that's where anti-Semitism is today. That's the most important thing to worry about for fighting anti-Semitism. And so before long, politicians across the spectrum in the West really took up this language. And fast forward to today, that's why you see both Donald Trump and Joe Biden and politicians on both sides of the aisle like really tripping over themselves to call any criticism of Israel and its genocide in Gaza anti-Semitic. This has been a longstanding tactic really used by the West to stifle criticism. So that's what we're seeing today from groups like the ADL.
Just to jump in on one thing, and I think to build on what Ben said, I think as like having an anti-fascist history and anti-fascist analysis, we've always seen people use like the language of anti-Zionism and try and like code that back to a sort of kind of far-right conspiracy analysis. And that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about this notion that anti-Zionism itself is inherently anti-Semitic, which is now filtered through the consciousness so completely that it's almost indistinguishable in the way that a lot of these mainstream organizations that are meant to fight anti-Semitism talk about it. And they want to end up conflating those things so much that it becomes difficult to parse them out.
One arrow in the quiver that leads to that is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and what are some of the controversies around how it's employed?
So the IHRA definition was originally kind of developed in the early 2000s as a kind of a tool used in mainly academic context as kind of a set of guidelines to ask the question, well, how can we evaluate whether a given statement is anti-Semitic or is not? And many of the original drafters of the IHRA definition really only intended it to be that, a mostly academic or maybe a human rights think tank kind of tool that could be useful, but not as any kind of binding policy. And fast forward to the mid-2010s, right? The BDS movement was gaining ground all throughout Europe and the USA, right? This is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, in a kind of a global call, for solidarity with Palestinians. And again, Israel's defenders got scared, and before long, they seized upon this IHRA definition as a tool to use to beat back this movement for Palestinian rights. And what they did is they started pushing to enshrine it into law and policy. And so today you have governments, state, local, and federal governments all around the world. You have universities, you have churches, you have various institutions and bodies who are now enshrining this IHRA definition into law. And what it does, the IHRA definition essentially is a list of guidelines of how do you evaluate if something is anti-Semitic. And some of them are pretty straightforward, right? Things like denying the Holocaust, or accusing the Jews of murdering Jesus, or accusing the Jews of controlling the world. But some of the statements are very ambiguously worded, basically to be used by Israel's defenders to basically label like a broad swath of criticism as anti-Semitic.
Yeah, we talk about some alternatives that have come around. One is the Jerusalem Declaration, which was created by a big group of scholars who wanted a more rigorous definition that's much more precise, scholars of many of which we interviewed for the book. And it tries to avoid the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, particularly the notion that's in the IHRA that, quote unquote, delegitimization of the state of Israel, the belief that the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist, however they phrase it. Walking away from that and trying to have a more concrete sense of how anti-Semitism works. So that ends up being a counterbalance, but that only gets like sort of a piece of it. And so what we've tried to do is, instead of avoiding just the kind of simplistic, narrow ways of defining it, we talk through a little bit more about what the historical contours of it are, how it actually shows up, and how people can parse it out in that way. because we hope that people come away with more of a deep understanding, not just of like when anti-Semitism appears, but how it's a social system, how it's related to other forms of oppression, how it kind of simmers under the surface in places more than just one incident at a time.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like the really dangerous thing with how the IHRA definition is being used right now is it's being used as a tool to quash a freedom of speech. It's being used as kind of a frontline weapon to further authoritarianism and McCarthyism on campuses. Yeah, and this has been going on for a long time. I mean, around 5 years ago, I worked as Jewish Voice for Peace's national campus organizer here in the U.S. And already then you saw Palestinian and Jewish, Arab and Muslim and all kinds of students who were just advocating for their universities to not fund Boeing as Boeing dropped bombs on Gaza. And before long, we saw student governments and administrators and university presidents citing the IHRA definition to basically say this was anti-Semitic, and more than that, to criminalize the speech or to deem the speech a violation of campus conduct. And this could lead to professors being fired. This could lead to students now being denied diplomas on campuses. In the hands of Republican governors, this could lead to universities being defunded. This could lead to nonprofits in the U.S. Being shut down or investigated for specious allegations like material support for terrorism. So really, the consequences for this campaign to enshrine the IHRA definition are very dire for free speech and free expression. And it's very, very ironic and very maddening, obviously, as Jews, that a campaign to supposedly protect us is being weaponized in this really dystopian way.
In Australia recently, there's been a lot of talk about social cohesion, and one incident that is pointed to as demonstrating cracks in the cohesion of the social contract was on October 9th in Sydney. There was a pro-Palestine protest, and one of a number of sort of these new reactionary, very small anti-Palestinian groups put out a video which seemed to depict hundreds, if not thousands, of people chanting "Gas the Jews." As it turned out, nobody had uttered those words at all. There was a very small group of people who were yelling something about Jews, but was not "Gas the Jews." Nevertheless, this went out quite widely, and in the recent anti-Semitism documentary on Sky News, people from more established Jewish institutions and politicians were saying, well, we don't know what happened, but it doesn't really matter. To me, I think it does matter whether thousands of people are chanting "Gas the Jews." I was wondering what your thoughts were on these groups like the Syrian Collective and the Australian Jewish Association, who produce misinformation and disinformation about anti-Semitism. To me, that doesn't seem to do much for Jewish safety.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this has accelerated since October 7th. There's these panicked responses that are looking for basically any expression of Palestinian solidarity, and then kind of reflexively assuming that it's anti-Semitism or motivated by anti-Semitism. And then we're seeing these stray accounts of incidents that are really hard to verify, very murky, but their specificity isn't important because what they're used as is part of kind of this broad framing of like, look at the generalized threat that's happening. So if you look into any individual instance, it might fall apart under scrutiny, but that's not so important because what we're talking about is a large spread. And I think that ends up being used to pump this feeling of fear, particularly about campuses in the US or particularly about places where protests are happening. And again, this ends up creating a misplacement of where we're supposed to do about it. So we talk about in the book, for example, like the problems of a lot of these organizations is also that they really push a police narrative that safety in Jewish communities comes from entrenching the police. But there's a real problem there, right? That doesn't understand the experiences of marginalized Jews that have faced maybe violence at the hands of the police. It doesn't actually look at the historic legacy relationship of Jews and police in a lot of places. And it again takes them away from what we think are the larger systems of safety, anti-fascist social movements, Jewish left in general, basically relationships with community partners. And so again, I think one of the problems here, beyond the fact that this is creating a political fervor that's being used more and more to manufacture consent for the war, is that it's actually being used and leveled as an attack against the very basically organizing institutions, radical institutions that I think are most effective in defending Jews because of fighting the far right and fighting anti-Semitism. When we look at a lot of the organizations that groups like in the US in particular go after, we're talking about Jewish Voice for Peace, sometimes, if not now, Jewish groups in a lot of ways, right? The Jewish left, the same Jewish left that's often doing trainings about anti-Semitism or have members that are in anti-fascist groups, things like that. So again, this misdirection ends up being an attack on the very protective elements that I think we should depend on if we want to build a viable fight against anti-Semitism into the future.
Yeah, totally. And what it's doing, as Shane was saying, is it's fueling the rise of the global far right. I mean, what you were describing over there in Australia, I'm so familiar with here in the US. It's basically these social media fueled disinformation campaigns that are really very, very similar to things like QAnon or right wing moral panics over CRT or so-called gender ideology in schools. Often it's the same playbook where they cherry pick a few seconds of a video and misconstrue it and turn it into a viral meme. And often it's amplified by bots. It's often amplified. There was recently a report that showed how thousands of fake social media accounts basically made by an organization in Israel are helping to pump out this narrative. And what it's doing is it's ramping up moral panic. It's ramping up fear. It's basically playing to many of the same bases of support for far-right politics in the U.S. as a way for them to really say these Palestine solidarity protests are symptomatic of non-white immigration, are symptomatic of racial justice movements. And the way to fight these Palestine solidarity protests is through mass deportation or is through banning DEI or CRT in schools. And it's really disturbing because not only is it a way to fuel the far right, it's also being used to drag some disaffected liberals into the MAGA coalition, or at least to neutralize them as an opposition of the MAGA coalition. And we're talking about not only liberal Jews or centrist Jews who might vote Democrat, but maybe might sit it out this year, right? Because who knows? The left is so anti-Semitic, and maybe we should consider Trump, right? And many non-Jews as well. So it's really a core mobilizing tool of authoritarianism in our era.
I want to pick up at one kind of unique feature we talk about a little bit in the book, but I think has been very visible over the last year, which is that in a very kind of strange reversal or confusion of terms, we even see anti-Semitic conspiracy theories being used to defend Israel. So we've seen, for example, people blaming campus protests on George Soros. I've even seen it made on the Rothschilds. We've seen a remarkable amount of conspiracy theories being basically just refashioned, old-fashioned QAnon style anti-Semitic libels, and then being used in defense of the Jewish state. This happens not uncommon on the Christian right, where basically evangelical Christian Zionism is such an important political force for them. And so in this confused world, this idea that Zionism is this kind of necessary protectorate to Jews, or that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitism, becomes even more confused and kind of discredited.
It strikes me as slightly myopic, this idea of that mass deportations decided by Christian nationalists based on their ideological preferences being the idea of supporting that when it's being used against pro-Palestine people. It does seem like it's a little short-sighted.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing about Likud's partnership with all these far-right national populist parties across Europe that themselves have very entrenched anti-Semitism in there, and of which leaders like Netanyahu just decide to look the other way, or have made a calculation and think, okay, well, anti-Semitism there is fine as long as we can get the political advantages we want here.
One figure you examine in the book is Meir Kahane, who was a fringe figure in life, but of late his legacy seems to have taken on larger proportions in Israel. Could you tell us a little bit about him and the Kahanist movement, I guess?
Yeah, I think we pick up on a lot of great scholars. Shaul Magid, who we interviewed for the book, also wrote a great book on Meir Kahane. And a lot of folks in the U.S. kind of know him because he founded the Jewish Defense League and was well known for going to war with American Nazis, but also more specifically going to war with black leaders and activist networks attacking Palestinian groups back before he made Aliyah to Israel. he became a much more important Israeli figure basically in the Israeli far right, particularly those who support quote unquote transfer, basically wanting to push Palestinians further out of their land and completely ethnically cleanse the occupied territories. But in a lot of ways, he always was sort of an American figure and brought that American sensibility. And one of the things that we talk about there, and this also comes from Shoel, is the impact that his ideology had on some parts of the Jewish world, basically a fatalism he had about Gentiles, this idea that they were innately anti-Semitic and that it goes back to some kind of like really deep biblical error. And so that we talk a little bit about this dynamic, the stories from Torah that are kind of told in this way. And we kind of frame it around the Crown Heights riots because this language was used very, very heavily then. And then we try and flip it on its head a little bit and say, what if we kind of re-understood that and we create a kind of different narrative? Because I think what has ended up happening with people like Kahana, and this is true of the far right in general, is that their legacy expands much further than they ever did. Their way of thinking ends up seeding itself not just in the right, but sometimes in centrist and even in the left politics of a community that they try and speak as representatives for. And so I think the effect of that, of the Kahanist politic, obviously is playing out right now in the Israeli right, particularly in the current coalition that's leading the war. But it's also ends up having an effect, I think, on modern American Jewish politics, at least the way that they understand anti-Semitism as this sort of eternalist formation that we can't ultimately defeat. And so against that dystopian way of reading it, we try and have a kind of new way of reading that history and projecting forward a sort of revolutionary optimism of what would it look like if instead we understood anti-Semitism as the result of social forces, the same that are responsible for other forms of oppression. And if we did that, where would we get partners and support in that fight?
Yeah, and just one more thing I want to say about Meir Kahane is that he was a straight-up Jewish fascist, and we see the legacy of his neo-fascism alive and well in Israel today, as Shane was saying, with the rise of radical right government ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich, who just a few years ago were relatively fringe radical figures in Israel and today hold some of the highest seats in power. But one thing all fascists have in common is anti-Semitism. And it's a bit ironic on the face of it, but really makes a lot more sense when you dig in, that the Kahanist project was really also deeply anti-Semitic in the way. That's one thing that we talk about in the book as well, that really Kahane's strain of militant far-right Zionism was all predicated on negating the Jewish diaspora. They basically said, and this goes way back to the origins of the Zionist movement, well, Jews in the diaspora for many centuries have been weak, they've been effeminate, they've been cosmopolitan, they don't know how to fight back, they don't know how to be strong and manly like others in Europe, and the way to kind of transform what has been so debased or degenerate about this diaspora Jew was to kind of have a rebirth of a new strong, manly Jew in the land of Israel, really an image of the new kind of Zionist Jew that was really modeled off of European nationalism. So you see these historical resonances that are really impossible to ignore. And so when you talk about like anti-Semitism historically and today, you also have to look at the anti-Semitism that's been really embedded in many ways in the Zionist project. And that's one thing that's so inspiring about the growth of new Jewish left movements today, is we're reclaiming these other ways of being Jewish that are founded, as Shane was saying, upon solidarity, upon collective liberation. And so that's just one thing I wanted to highlight too.
Speaking of the left, although anti-Semitism is strongly associated with the right, it's obviously in evidence on the left, broadly speaking. And I think one of the arguments you put is that in some ways the left has failed or is currently being challenged by this resurgence in anti-Semitism. I was wondering, Shane and Ben, if you could elaborate on what you understand as being the relationship between anti-Semitism and the left.
Yeah, I think we talk about in the book that anti-Semitism is not something that had been discussed in the more recent eras of the left. This is a little bit different historically, but anti-Semitism is not something that tends to be on the kind of front of people's minds in a lot of leftist spaces. There's not tends to be not a lot of trainings. This has changed a little bit in the last couple of years when we talk about some of that change that's happened in the book, particularly with the kind of returning growth of the Jewish left. But it hasn't featured as much, and so there's less consciousness about it, except in certain different pockets of the left. So anti-fascism being a place where people discuss anti-Semitism frequently because of its centrality in white nationalism, or in like Jewish feminism and certain kind of areas of critical Marxism, things like that. But historically, there's just not that much of an analysis about it. And the question of kind of anti-Semitism on the left, where it has appeared, has oftentimes been around conspiracy theories when they've been allowed in, weak analysis like we had mentioned. So like when people, instead of having a kind of analysis of global imperialism or how capitalism works, instead choosing with conspiracy theories or using these kind of stereotypes about who the capitalists are, or making assumptions about who holds power based on these kind of their identities in that way. And a lot of that comes, again, from not having the tools of actually confronting it. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is that if we actually want to invest in the left as a vessel for Jewish safety, then we have to really invest in the left in doing that. That means confronting those things when they happen. That means agitating, organizing, and educating people about those issues and making sure there's actually access to it. And I don't want to be Pollyanna about that. That doesn't mean it goes well all the time, right? Like we're talking about spaces and a lot of times where people haven't actually encountered a really liberatory conversation about anti-Semitism. But the reality is that we're going to have to actually go in there and do that work. Otherwise, that won't actually develop. And I think some people are doing that. There's some shining spots on it. And I think the fact that, like, obviously we're having conversations like this with the book coming out, I think people are kind of hungry to have that conversation more.
Yeah. And one thing that we learned a lot when doing the interviews for the book, I remember one organizer told me a metaphor that's really stuck with me. And he said that when queer folks in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s were going into the left, they were already on the left, of course, and they were saying, hey, comrades, we need to learn about anti-LGBTQ bigotry, and we need to take it seriously and to fight it. They encountered some resistance too, right? Like within the feminist movement, many other spaces. It really takes some time for members of a marginalized group to really gain the confidence, really to speak about their own oppression and to gain the courage and the fortitude to really call on others, really to take it seriously. And we're seeing that happen right now around anti-Semitism, right? Ideas change gradually over time. I think another thing that makes it hard is, as we've been talking about today, the left is so often hit with these bogus or these spurious or these weaponized anti-Semitism claims that folks are bruised by it. Folks are pissed, and folks don't want to even think about anti-Semitism as a real thing, because the only time they ever hear about it is when it's obviously a BS accusation. And the last thing I'll say is, since October 7th, we've seen some anti-Semitism on the left come in through conspiracy theories, like Shane was saying, particularly around Zionism, right? And we were saying anti-Semitism is always a conspiracy theory of Jewish world domination of some sort. And the way that it can come around Zionism is if people get confused and think that, for example, the U.S. government supports Israel because there's a Zionist cabal, right? That's just behind the scenes, or mainstream media is so pro-Israel because of Zionists just are up in there, really controlling the media. And what's important to really counter that is that the U.S. really doesn't need some Jewish cabal behind the scenes to support Israel, because the U.S. has long held it in its own imperial interest really to use Israel as a beachhead for dominance in the Middle East, right? And the U.S. has deep settler resonances with Israel. The U.S. has tens of millions of Christian Zionists in the base, not to mention many Christian Zionist politicians. Right. So really, like, we need like an intersectional and a structural analysis of why the U.S. supports Israel. And that's often the best antidote, if you will, to making sure that conspiracy theories have no place on the left, is just by being really clear about where power actually lies. And that's a thing we talk about a lot in the book as well.
One thing I would add to is that I think one person I interviewed for the book kind of pointed this out, of when I was asking basically, have you heard anti-Semitic comments or seen anti-Semitic behavior in leftist spaces? And they were like, well, of course I have, because they are spaces and they have people in them. And people say all kinds of racist, offensive, homophobic things in all kinds of leftist movements because they absorb the same messages anybody does. And so I think there's this way that we talk about anti-Semitism sometimes that's different than the way we talk about other forms of oppression or misbehavior or things like that, where we assume that when it comes out, it has a sort of ideological sophistication or a commitment to it that other forms of oppression don't. And that means that that's clearly just the tip of the iceberg for this person. And that is not always the case. The reality is that social movements are composed of complicated people. They're uneven in their consciousness and their ideas. And so we can expect to actually find that in the same that we can expect to find racism playing out in social movements that on the face are there to oppose racism because we're talking about actual human beings.
Yeah, and like anti-Semitism is part of the world we live in. It's part of the air we all breathe in a way. We all inherit it simply by virtue of living in a society that's structured by white Christian supremacy, by cis heteropatriarchy, by all the forms of oppression. And it's up to us to do conscious unlearning of this stuff, or else, as Shane said, we're liable to repeat it.
In terms of understanding anti-Semitism, and I'm thinking in particular of, I guess, the contemporary United States, but the world generally, it's often understood as a form of racism, which is related to other forms of racism and oppression. Do you think there's something that's distinctive about anti-Semitism as a species of racism, or what's the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism and other forms of oppression, structural oppression in general? Yeah. Like, what are the terms of that relationship, and how should it inform our understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, yeah, we often hear anti-Semitism talked about as a kind of racism. Sometimes we even hear the two terms interchangeably. And there's a reason for that. There is some merit to it. Anti-Semitism, in modern anti-Semitism, it really grew out of the same stew as modern racism. In Europe in the 1800s into the present, Jews were racialized as having big noses, as being quote unquote Semites, as being the Nazis obviously thought of Jews as a wholly separate race, right? So anti-Semitism does have some characteristics that are very similar to how we think about racism. But at the same time, there are some pieces that are distinct, right? And one way we talk about it in the book is where we think of racism, it tends to imagine punching down. It imagines like a group, say Black folks, for example, that are deemed biologically inferior or below whites on hierarchies, right? And anti-Semitism can have that too, right? Jewish immigrants 100 years ago were scapegoated as dirty, as unwelcome, as unwanted. But the conspiracy theory aspect of anti-Semitism is one thing that makes it distinct, right? Like anti-Semitism is imagined as a kind of punching up at the hidden heights of power. And that does make it distinct, but all forms of oppression have some aspects that are similar and shared, and some aspects that are distinct. So I think it's important not to exceptionalize and think that anti-Semitism is this kind of wholly a unique unicorn out there. All forms of oppression have a lot of resonances and have some specific characteristics. Shane, I wonder what you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with that they're shared characteristics, but also always have distinctive qualities. But one of the other things, too, is that they're always interrelated. And we have an entire chapter in the book that talks about how anti-Semitism is directly correlated with other forms of oppression, whether or not it's a sort of key feature of a lot of anti-Black narratives, the idea that Jews are controlling people of color, or that they're bringing non-white immigrants and replacing native-born whites. If you look at, for example, the contemporary attack on trans rights or sex ed in school, things like that, it's anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that's giving a lot of its cohesion. It's blaming it on Soros or Rothschilds or other figures. So there's really a built-in connection there. And the reality is that actually creates a certain shared struggle between communities. We have the same interest in some ways because the same people are sort of coming and trying to victimize communities. We also talk about the ways that a vastly unequal society sort of births conspiracy theories like this. So we look at the structural roots of this. The reality is that capitalism creates a profoundly unequal society with disenfranchised people that are looking to explain their situations, don't have clear views on how power works all the time, and are actually actively trying to free themselves. And so building anti-Semitic conspiracy theories is sometimes an attempt at doing that. It's a false attempt, but it is an attempt. And so we need to think about the actual material conditions that end up birthing this. What can we do to actually look at the shared origins of oppression? And when we do that, we end up realizing that our safety ends up being built entirely on how we can connect with other communities that have the same kind of targets in mind.
Yeah, and just to round that out, something we say is ultimately we can't defeat anti-Semitism without a revolution, right? As Shane was saying, anti-Semitism thrives in conditions of massive inequality and exploitation and instability. And really, we need to build a new world. We need to transform the world that we live in order to get rid of this alienation at the roots. That's what conspiracy theories feed on. That's what all forms of repression really feed on. So our book really tends to chart a path forward for joint struggle between Jews and all marginalized groups. We all have a stake in building a better world, and that's where we gotta come from. And you're not going to find that in the way the ADL talks about it or the way that Joe Biden or Donald Trump talk about it. But we need social movements to really start putting that analysis out there and charting a new horizon of safety through solidarity.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. The book is Safety Through Solidarity. It is out at all good bookstores. Shane Burley, Ben Lorber, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
Well, Andy, that is our show. We'll be back next week with our Radiothon special.
Ooh, exciting.
So get your fingers down into those pockets and get ready to give us some money.
Please do.
All right. We'll see you then.
Okay. Bye-bye.
3CR Radiothon fundraiser, June 2024.
From Palestine to Kashmir, from Tibet to Western Sahara, people are fighting against occupation, colonization, and the denial of their fundamental rights.
The overwhelming majority of crew that's getting arrested are American Jews. They're using their privilege to defend their Palestinian and Muslim siblings. That's what solidarity looks like.
We are with you and you are with us, and they do not anticipate and they are completely fearful of this level of solidarity.
3CR, sound on for solidarity.
We need your support to keep radical voices and issues on the airwaves.
Donate online at 3cr.org.au.
Do you work in a brothel, massage shop, escort agency, fetish house or dungeon, cam studio or porn set, sauna, short-time hotel, outdoors or on the street, or in any other space where sex work happens? Recent changes to Victorian sex work laws mean that sex workers now have more options for how and where we can work and who we can work with.
To find out more about Victoria's new sex work laws, contact Vixen, Victoria's statewide peer-only sex work organization, 100% by and for all sex workers, on 039 070 9050.
And talk to another sex worker about what the partial decriminalisation of sex work means for you, your workplace and your community. Or check out the Decrim Info Hub at vixen.org.au. Vixen is a 3CR supporter.